Hey guys, welcome to the Sleepy Historium channel. Tonight we set our feet on the softest, slowest trail imaginable. A trail that stretches beyond the horizon, shimmering under moonlight, flanked by dunes that look like frozen ocean waves. We're wandering into the old postal routes of the Sahara Desert. This isn't your corner mailbox and a cheerful postman whistling a tune. Out here, you wait weeks, sometimes months, for a message, and you hope it doesn't vanish into a sandstorm first. You probably won't survive this trip yourself, not unless you've mastered drinking air and turning sunburn into a personality trait. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like sharing, tell me your location and what time it is where you are. I love knowing where you're all listening in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You pull your scarf tighter around your face, feeling the fine dust of Sahara twilight on your lips. The sun has just slipped under the horizon, turning the sand a shade of pale gold that glows faintly in the moonrise. The silence is immense, so heavy you can hear your own heartbeat. But somewhere far away, a camel bell chimes like a lost wind chime. This is where letters once moved, not in neat envelopes, but wrapped in rough cloth, tucked into saddlebags, passed hand to hand across thousands of kilometers of emptiness. Historians say these desert post routes started long before Europeans ever imagined postal stamps. The Berber tribes of North Africa, skilled at surviving where even lizards think twice, developed informal networks to send messages from caravan to caravan. A merchant in the salt mines of Tagaza could send word to his partner in Timbuktu about a new shipment, and that word would ripple through trusted riders, each one knowing which oasis to stop at, which waterholes weren't poisoned, and which sand ridges hinted at a hidden raiders' camp. But here's the thing. Historians still argue whether these were truly postal systems, in the sense of organized schedules and fees, or just strings of personal favors and hired couriers that looked like a postal network from afar. You step forward, and the sand gives softly under your sandals, as if you're walking on powdered glass. A whispering wind moves past, lifting the edge of your robe. If you squint at the stars, you can just see the line of a caravan etched against the night. Dozens of camels linked in single file, each one carrying salt slabs, ivory tusks, small leather satchels full of letters and receipts, the paperwork of a trade world most people today forget existed. The smell out here isn't nothing. It's dust mixed with the faint tang of old fires. You imagine a camp set up hours before you arrived, a circle of stones, a few flatbreads baking on embers, a lone courier scribbling on goatskin by the light of an oil lamp. He pauses, dipping his reed pen into ink made from soot and gum arabic, because a gust of wind has just blown half the sand dunes into his lap. You know how email has a drafts folder? Out here, drafts are literally sandblasted off your page before you can send them. One fact stands out as you walk. These routes weren't just about messages. They were lifelines, connecting tiny communities scattered like beads across the Sahara. Without couriers, a town could go weeks without news of food caravans or safety warnings. Archaeologists even found accounts of long desert journeys where letters weren't addressed to individuals but to whoever gets there first, like throwing a bottle into an ocean made of sand. You pause to look up at the Milky Way. It's brighter here than you've ever seen it, a thick river of stars pouring overhead. Imagine navigating this emptiness without roads, using only those stars, and still having the confidence to say, "Yes, I'll make sure your letter gets there." Historians still debate whether early routes followed consistent paths or shifted constantly with weather, politics, and tribal agreements. Some think there were well-worn mail highways in the desert. Others argue it was always a guessing game, one dune never exactly where you left it. A few more steps, and your foot knocks against something buried. You crouch and brush sand away, half expecting treasure. It's a shard of pottery, once part of a water jug a courier carried centuries ago. You hold it to the moonlight, feel the faint ridges where fingers once shaped clay for a purpose as ordinary as thirst. Out here, thirst could kill faster than the absence of news. The desert night grows cooler. You pull your scarf a little tighter and imagine yourself as a rider, leaning forward on a patient camel, letters tucked against your chest, eyes scanning for the next patch of shade where someone will wait to take the burden from you. It's the slowest form of communication you've ever known, yet somehow, in a world without Wi-Fi, it got the job done. And you keep walking, the first grains of a long story slipping through your fingers like time itself, with thousands of miles still ahead and a trail of forgotten words to follow. You wake with the sun on your eyelids, even though you swear you barely slept a wink. Out here in the desert, dawn doesn't creep in, it stomps across the horizon in blazing gold. Heat already curling off the sand before you've stretched your legs. You squint, rubbing grit from your eyelashes, and you're not alone anymore. There's movement at the edge of camp. Lean, quiet figures in loose robes, checking saddles, tying up bundles, whispering to their camels. These are the couriers, the people who made the impossible possible. They carried words where even the wind hesitated to go. You shuffle closer because this is what you came to see. The Berber and Tuareg riders are legends of these routes. Without them, letters would have died a slow, papery death in the middle of nowhere. Each courier owns an uncanny knowledge of the desert, handed down like a family recipe for survival. They know which dunes hide firm ground and which will swallow a camel's leg. They remember every stubborn well that coughs up bitter water only after you talk to it nicely. Historians still argue whether these couriers worked independently, running errands for whoever paid, or whether certain clans controlled entire stretches of the route like franchise owners of desert communication. Either way, you wouldn't dream of crossing this expanse without one of them leading the way. You watch as one man packs his saddlebag with almost nothing: a goatskin flask of water, a small bundle of dried dates, a packet of letters tied in leather cord, and a curved dagger that seems more practical for cutting rope than fighting anyone. There's no space for luxuries. When every extra ounce makes the camel groan, you only carry what keeps you alive or gets the message through. A second courier adjusts a faded scarf around his face, its ends bleached white from years of sandblasting. The cloth muffles his laugh as one camel decides to kneel stubbornly and refuse to get up, a comic little protest before the day's march begins. Even here there's room for a joke. A grumbling camel sounds a lot like a broken tuba, and you chuckle under your breath. The mainstream fact everyone agrees on is this: the Tuareg, known as the Blue Men of the Desert because of the indigo dye in their veils, were instrumental in keeping trade and news flowing. They were navigators, negotiators, and sometimes peacekeepers. A message between two rival clans might only arrive safely because a Tuareg courier had the trust of both sides. But there's a quirkier tidbit you don't hear in school books. Some couriers trained their camels to recognize the smell of certain oases. It sounds far-fetched, like desert folklore, but travelers wrote accounts of camels perking up long before water was in sight, steering toward familiar scents of palm groves or salty marshes. You shuffle along beside the group as they form a single-file line. One man calls out softly, a low chant, and the camels rise with groans that vibrate in your bones. Dust swirls around their padded feet, and suddenly you're part of a moving ribbon threading through nothingness. There's no road sign saying, "This way to Timbuktu," just a horizon that never seems to get closer. The only clues are occasional stone markers left by earlier travelers, or the way a certain dune curves like a beckoning finger. Historians still argue whether these couriers had mental maps more accurate than anything drawn on parchment, or whether, realistically, they were just gambling on instinct and memory every time. The pace is slow, steady, hypnotic. You sway in time with the camels and let your eyes wander. The couriers don't chatter much. One hums a tune under his breath, maybe to keep awake, maybe to soothe the animals. Another flicks a glance at you, half amused. You look like you've already had enough of this sun, and it's not even midday. But this is their element. They can march for 10 hours under a sky that looks like it's been ironed flat, never rushing, never stopping longer than needed. A postal service built on this kind of endurance feels more like an act of devotion than a job. By afternoon, heat waves ripple like ghosts on the horizon, and you can't tell if you're walking on Earth or inside a mirage. The letters are still tucked safely in that saddlebag ahead, though. Each one is a small weight of human thought, words somebody cared enough to send despite the desert standing in the way. There's no guarantee they'll arrive, no guarantee anyone will even be alive to read them at the other end. Yet still, riders like these wake before dawn, swing onto their camels, and start another day's march. When they finally stop near a cluster of acacia trees for shade, you flop down gratefully onto warm sand. A courier offers you a dried date, which tastes like sugar baked in sunlight, and pours a trickle of water into your palm. It's not a feast, but it feels like a blessing. Around you, they tie up their camels and inspect the satchels. One of the men checks a wax-sealed pouch, frowning. The seal is cracked, not a good sign. Maybe a sandstorm jostled it loose, or maybe someone along the chain peeked inside. The desert keeps its secrets, and sometimes it swallows truth as easily as footprints. Evening creeps back in, and the light goes soft again. The couriers gather their animals for another push, this time under stars that glitter sharp enough to guide them west. You feel a strange calm knowing that words are moving through this wilderness stitched together by human determination alone. The Sahara may seem empty, but every step these riders take keeps a thread of connection alive between distant souls. The desert night feels cooler now, a blessing after that furnace of a day. Your lips are cracked, but your curiosity hasn't dried out yet. You're finally close enough to watch one of the couriers kneel by a low fire, a small leather pouch on his knee. Inside are letters, some plain, some marked with strange, colorful stains. You lean in and catch a whisper of old earth, almost like clay. These are the first postmarks of the desert, long before paper stamps became a thing. He pulls one folded scrap out, handling it as carefully as you'd cradle a sleeping mouse. There's no wax seal. Wax would melt faster than butter under this sun. Instead, you see a smudge of reddish-brown mud, hardened in the corner of the letter, like someone dabbed it there deliberately. The courier smiles faintly and explains, in a low, slow tone, that this is how messages were marked in some parts of the Sahara, with a fingerprint of wet clay, or sometimes powdered ochre mixed with water, pressed into the parchment. It was both a seal and a signature, saying this passed through my hands. Simple, fragile, but good enough for a network that stretched across thousands of shifting miles. Historians know this much. Wax seals were rare in hot, dry climates where soft beeswax would melt or crumble to dust. Merchants and early couriers used what they had: clay, sand mixed with camel milk, or even lumps of salt, hardened and tied to a cord. But historians still argue whether these makeshift marks were part of an organized system, like early stamps, or just improvised checks so letters wouldn't be confused in a jumble of similar satchels. There are no surviving postal archives from this network, only fragmentary letters and secondhand accounts from traders. You can almost picture the scene: a caravan stopping for a moment, someone kneeling in the sand with a bowl of ochre water, dabbing marks before moving on. One courier notices you staring and grins, joking that a good desert postmark lasted just long enough to reach the next campfire. Anything longer was a miracle. He flicks a bit of dried clay from his fingernail, shrugs, and says sometimes the marks fell off entirely, which made for amusing arguments at delivery. "No, this was meant for me, I swear." The desert doesn't care about human mistakes. It just erases them under another gust of wind. The letters themselves feel strange when you're allowed to touch one. It's not paper like you know it. This is rough, fibrous stuff, maybe early parchment, maybe even palm leaf, depending on who wrote it. You trace your finger over ink that's faded to a dusty brown. The courier says the ink came from soot mixed with gum arabic or date palm sap, easy to make on the road. The strokes are slow and deliberate, almost like calligraphy, because writing in a shaky tent with a reed pen isn't a fast process. Every word is an effort, every sentence precious. The desert didn't just slow delivery, it slowed thought itself. You imagine a merchant hundreds of miles away, squinting under a similar oil lamp, carefully writing out a letter to warn a partner about rising salt prices, or to ask for another shipment of cloth. Each line is heavy with the weight of distance. There's no, "Oops, I forgot a detail, I'll just text them later." There's only this one chance, one letter, one risky journey over burning sand. And you think about how strange it is that something so fragile could endure here. Sand and wind tear everything apart, even stone carvings, yet a scrap of parchment with a clay mark could travel across kingdoms. Archaeologists have dug up pieces of these letters centuries later, half decayed, with faint marks still visible. Some of those marks are indecipherable now. Historians still debate if they were just fingerprints or actual merchant symbols, a primitive coding system for routes and recipients. The arguments can go on for hours in university halls far from the desert, while the real answer might still be buried under 10 more feet of dunes. The fire cracks softly, the camels grunt in their sleep, and you watch as the courier reseals a letter using a pinch of damp sand. It clings like dust to sweat, a temporary fix, enough to keep the fold shut until morning. You realize there's no permanence out here. Everything is transient. Footprints, campsites, even these messages. The only lasting thing is the effort to keep people connected, no matter how rough the method. As the group settles in for the night, you tuck your scarf under your head and stare at the stars. Somewhere, beyond the horizon, someone is waiting for these words, counting days, praying they'll arrive. And in the middle of this vast silence, you understand. The desert postmark isn't just a seal, it's a promise in clay and dust, fragile and human, stubbornly trying to outlast the wind. The next day, you wake to the smell of dust warming under the sun, and the sound of camels snorting in irritation. They always sound irritated, like they've just read a bad review of their work ethic. The caravan moves on at a slow sway, each step crunching over sand as pale as bone. By mid-morning, you spot what seems impossible in this sea of dunes. A green mirage that doesn't vanish when you blink. An oasis. The heat presses on you like a heavy blanket, but the sight of palms ahead pulls you forward, and suddenly you understand why these places became the Sahara's postal offices long before anyone thought of post boxes and stamps. The group approaches carefully because every oasis has its own rules. Some are neutral zones where rival tribes agree to rest without quarrel. Others are fiercely controlled by local families, who charge for water the way modern airports charge for bottled drinks. A ring of tamarisk trees offers shade, and you feel the temperature drop with every step closer. The couriers halt, tying up the camels near a shallow pool that glints like a handful of polished glass dropped in the sand. Here, words change hands. Merchants squat under the palms, their faces hidden behind veils, small clay cups of tea balanced on the sand between them. A man from a distant caravan unwraps a bundle of messages and begins calling out names softly, like reciting a lullaby. People shuffle forward, exchanging letters, passing them along with murmurs of thanks or quick negotiations for future deliveries. The oasis feels less like a meeting of strangers and more like a family reunion where everyone has news to trade. Mainstream historians know that oases like Tuat, Bilma, and Tadeni were more than watering holes. They were communication hubs, lifelines for trade networks stretching from the Niger River to the Mediterranean coast. Salt caravans might pause here for days, waiting for guides or word of safe routes ahead. Messages accumulated like leaves in a corner of the courtyard. News of births, deaths, wars, shipments, debts, even poetry meant to impress distant scholars. But the quirky detail that makes you smile is how these oases had their own informal postmasters. Not official, uniformed figures, just respected elders, tea sellers, or scribes known to keep track of who came through. A traveler might leave a letter with a shopkeeper, who promised to hand it to the next caravan headed in the right direction. Sometimes messages stayed stuck for weeks because nobody knew which way the right direction actually was. And sometimes letters were delivered years late, handed to descendants because the original addressee had long since vanished into the sands. Historians still debate how organized this system truly was. Was it deliberate, with known rates and records, or just a patchwork of trust and handshakes? Some think certain oases acted like proto-post offices, keeping crude ledgers of incoming and outgoing messages. Others argue there was nothing written, only memory and reputation, a dangerous thing to rely on in a world where names could be forgotten overnight. You sit cross-legged in the shade, feeling relief seep into your bones. A child toddles by, clutching a strip of dried camel meat in one hand and a letter in the other, apparently just as valuable. A woman nearby carefully opens a scrap of parchment, smiles, then tucks it into her robe with a reverence you recognize instantly. These messages are tiny miracles that survived the desert. There's a rhythm here, as soothing as a heartbeat. The sound of water trickling from a leather bucket, the soft murmurs of men haggling over salt slabs while a courier unrolls a fresh piece of goatskin to write a quick note for someone too tired to hold a pen. The occasional plop of a date pit into the sand. If you listen closely, you can imagine the echoes of 1,000 similar meetings over centuries, all in this same patch of green. A little post office built not of bricks, but of shared need and fragile hope. And like every good postal hub, gossip thrives here. You overhear two old riders laughing about a letter that once traveled in the wrong direction for 6 months because someone trusted the wrong caravan leader. Another story surfaces about a message tied to a falcon's leg as an experiment. It allegedly arrived faster than any camel. But nobody knows if that tale's true or just desert humor stretched thin over too much tea. By afternoon, the sun leans west, and the oasis begins to empty. Letters are tucked into saddlebags, water skins are topped off, and the world's quietest post office closes shop until the next set of weary travelers appear. You rise reluctantly, brushing sand from your clothes. Part of you wants to stay, surrounded by palms and the low hum of shared stories. But the desert pulls you onward, and you follow the couriers out, back into the white glare of shifting dunes. One last look over your shoulder, the oasis shrinks behind you, the palms merging with the horizon until it seems like it never existed. And you realize this was the only fixed address for hundreds of miles. Not a building with a postal code, but a patch of shade, a shared understanding, and the hope that words could keep moving, one hand to another, long after you'd walked away. The sun climbs higher, burning the sky pale as bone, and the caravan drifts westward again. The desert is quieter now, only the scuff of camel feet and the occasional creak of a leather strap breaking the silence. You fall into the rhythm of the march, your mind wandering to the unseen map beneath your feet. There are no signs, no mile markers, yet these couriers move as if the route is tattooed on their memory. It's not just instinct. They're following ancient trails, older than any empire, carved not by rulers but by necessity. Historians agree that trans-Saharan communication piggybacked on trade. Salt caravans, gold traders, pilgrims on the way to Mecca all needed guidance through this enormous, shifting wilderness. A message could hitch a ride on any of these journeys, passed from one group to the next like a whispered secret in a game of telephone that stretched over thousands of miles. You watch as the lead courier lifts his head toward a distant ridge, adjusts the line of travel, and doesn't even glance at the horizon again. Later, he explains with a shrug that it's not just stars and sun. They know the wind's memory. Sand shifts in patterns only locals can read. You squint at the dunes and see nothing but waves of gold. He sees a direction home. There's a quirkier tidbit, though, one that makes you grin in disbelief. Some routes were said to be marked not by stones or flags, but by the bones of camels long gone, bleached white in the sun. Too grim to be decorative, too deliberate to be coincidence. Writers supposedly left skeletons in line with the path, a morbid breadcrumb trail across hundreds of miles. Historians still argue whether this was intentional or just the desert keeping its own ledger of lost caravans, but travelers swore they navigated stretches of wasteland by counting ribs on the sand. Every so often, a courier stops, crouches, and scratches lines in the ground with a stick. They look like meaningless doodles to you, but they're quick sketches of landmarks, new ridges, or vanished watering holes. This information gets shared at the next stop, building a living, shifting map that existed only in memory and conversation. Paper maps were rare, expensive, and prone to fluttering away on a stiff breeze. So routes lived inside people, in songs, in rhymes about safe paths and cursed wells. Forget one verse, and you might lose 3 days' worth of precious water. And then there were the safe houses, if you could call a roofless stone ruin with a low wall and a windbreak a house. You pass one near noon, its walls barely waist high, but a rough clay pot still sits in the corner, ready to hold rainwater that hasn't fallen in years. Couriers point it out with pride, as if introducing you to an old friend who hasn't aged well. Messages were often left in these shelters under rocks or tied to sticks, meant for whoever came next. Sometimes they lasted long enough to be collected. Sometimes they blew away. The desert didn't care either way. Historians still debate whether these safe houses were part of an intentional postal chain or just convenient accidents of trade and pilgrimage. There's no written order, no kingly decree saying, build stations every 20 miles. Yet enough ruins align along certain routes to make you think somebody planned it, even if planning in the Sahara was more about survival than bureaucracy. By midday, the heat gnaws at your resolve. You pull your scarf tighter, imagining what it must have felt like for a lone rider pushing through here with nothing but a scrap of parchment tied to his belt. Maybe it was a love letter, maybe a warning of war. Either way, there was no comfort, no promise of a reply, just a burning horizon and a hope you wouldn't get lost among dunes that all looked the same. The couriers tease you gently when you stumble, one of them chuckling that you'd never pass the desert exam, a test no one writes down, but everyone takes, with life as the grade. You grin weakly and keep moving, wondering how many unmarked paths you're walking over, how many forgotten footprints these dunes have swallowed. The desert has no patience for monuments. Its postal routes, like its travelers, leave only the faintest traces, carried in memories that vanish as easily as wind-blown sand. By the time evening spills across the dunes, painting them with bruised purples and dusky gold, you find yourself settling into the slow cadence of desert travel. The caravan halts on a patch of firmer ground where the sand crunches like broken shells underfoot. Tonight, you're promised something special, a chance to see how messages are handed over in true desert style, not by letter, but by voice. One of the couriers beckons you closer, a sly grin beneath his sun-bleached scarf. Around the fire, they prepare for what they call oral post, stories and messages carried in memory, passed from one person to another like treasures too valuable to risk on fragile parchment. The desert, they tell you, was never kind to paper. Even well-wrapped scrolls could get soaked, shredded, or simply crumble into dust. But a message locked inside someone's mind? That could last a lifetime, assuming the messenger survived the journey. You watch as one man leans in, murmuring a series of names, dates, and instructions to another. It's not just a list, it's a rhythm, almost a chant designed to stick. The recipient repeats it back, nodding, reshaping the words so they flow like a little poem. Later, you learn this wasn't uncommon. Many Saharan routes relied on memory couriers, trusted travelers who would carry not just one message, but sometimes dozens, layered inside their heads like a pile of fragile glass cups. And the trick was to not break any. Mainstream historians acknowledge this oral tradition as a crucial part of desert communication, though written evidence is scarce for obvious reasons. What survives are scattered accounts from 10th to 15th century Arab geographers describing word-bearers who delivered entire market reports or political news by speech alone, no parchment involved. These men were praised for their tongues of iron, meaning their words stayed solid even under pressure. The quirky bit? Some couriers supposedly tied knots in leather thongs or camel reins as memory aids, one knot per message. You picture someone unraveling a strap at journey end, retelling each message as they slide a knot loose, like unspooling a reel of recorded thoughts. Historians still argue whether this technique actually existed or if it's just travelers' lore, a neat story told around fires like this one. But looking at the desert's vast emptiness, you think, why wouldn't they? Anything that kept words alive would have been worth trying. The firelight flickers across faces as more messages are recited. Some practical. News of a caravan expected next week. Warnings of bandits near a certain well. Others are surprisingly tender. One merchant, too poor to hire a scribe, entrusted his affection to memory, a simple phrase telling his wife he was safe and would be home before the new moon. That's all, just 20 seconds of speech carried over hundreds of miles. You swallow hard, realizing the sheer faith that took. When it's your turn, someone jokes that you must leave a message too. You laugh nervously but give in, saying something absurd. Maybe just, "Send more snacks, this desert is too big." They grin, repeat it back, and promise to pass it along, even though you both know it'll vanish with the next gust of wind. Still, the act feels strangely comforting, as though words themselves build a bridge across this endless sea of sand. The desert night grows colder, stars littering the sky like spilled salt. The couriers lean back, humming low tunes, their minds quietly holding half a dozen messages each. Somewhere far ahead, other fires flicker in other camps, waiting for these spoken words to arrive safely. You think of how easily information slips away in your world. Emails deleted, texts unread, but here, every word matters. Every syllable is freighted with responsibility. Forgetting one isn't just an accident, it's a broken link in a fragile chain stretching across continents. As you drift towards sleep, you hear one last quiet exchange. A courier rehearses a message for a distant chieftain, his tone solemn. He repeats it 3 times before nodding to himself, satisfied it won't be lost to fatigue or shifting dunes. In this moment, you realize the desert had its own postal service of flesh and memory, as fragile as it was brilliant. A system that could never be stamped or filed, but somehow, often enough, worked. Dawn creeps in softly, a pale gold line on the horizon, and you wake to find the caravan already packing up. Camels grumbling in their usual "why are mornings legal" tone. Today's talk among the riders isn't about water or safe routes, it's about speed. Apparently, a rival caravan is ahead, and your group wants to catch up, partly for safety in numbers, partly to hand off a bundle of messages bound north toward Morocco. You've heard whispers of these relay caravans, a loose network of traders and couriers who kept letters moving faster than one lone rider ever could. Imagine it, a message leaving Timbuktu changing hands 5, 6, maybe a dozen times before it reached Fez or even the edge of Spain. No central command, no official postmaster general waving a flag, just trust, grit, and the occasional deal sealed over tea. Mainstream historians agree that this relay style underpinned Saharan communications for centuries. The great salt and gold routes of the Mali Empire, for example, weren't just trade highways, they were information highways too. News of a distant king's death or a market flooded with cheap copper could beat the caravans carrying the goods themselves, purely because word of mouth or a fast-moving rider could outpace a train of laden camels. The quirky tidbit: some relays supposedly used specially trained desert runners, not riders, but men on foot, lean and wiry as whippets, said to jog across stretches where camels couldn't go. They carried almost nothing but a water skin and a small pouch of dates, slipping through dune passes while heavier caravans detoured for miles. Historians still argue whether these sand runners truly existed, or whether they're romantic embellishments by later storytellers. But when one courier points to a thin trail vanishing into the heat haze and claims a runner took it this morning, you start to wonder if the legend might be true. You ride alongside one of the older men, who explains how a message can change owners half a dozen times, yet still reach its destination intact. It's all about reputation. A bad courier, the kind who loses letters or worse, reads them, finds himself unwelcome at the next campfire. A good one becomes a name whispered with respect, someone merchants would trust with gold dust, promises of marriage, or delicate political tidings. There were even informal tariffs, a scrap of silver or a pinch of salt for each handoff, like paying road tolls for words instead of wagons. As midday bleaches the sky white, the group spots dark specks ahead. Another caravan. Shouts go up. Camels pick up the pace with exaggerated reluctance, and soon you're surrounded by strangers who greet your guides like long-lost cousins. There's a flurry of activity, letters pulled from bags, names checked, directions confirmed. 2 bundles are swapped, one for a city you've never heard of, the other marked for North Coast, urgent. You ask what urgent means in the desert. The answer? Less than 3 months. Everyone laughs, because out here, speed is relative, and the Sahara swallows impatience faster than footprints. And yet, the system works. Letters destined for places weeks away are suddenly a little closer to home, simply because you've met another set of reliable hands going the right direction. You imagine a chain of such meetings stretching all the way across the desert. Fires flickering, tea pouring, names whispered in the dark, messages passed like precious seeds to be planted far away. Historians still debate how coordinated this network truly was. Was there an unspoken schedule, a rhythm that traders knew by heart, or was it pure luck and happenstance? Some surviving travelogues mention regular information days at major hubs like Agadez or Gao, where caravans gathered to swap not just goods, but news. Others claim it was chaos, with letters wandering for months until a sympathetic stranger carried them onward. Whatever the truth, you're witnessing something halfway between a post office and a miracle. As night falls and the two caravans part ways, you realize you've just watched a living, breathing post office in motion. No walls, no desks, just people, animals, and a fragile chain of trust that stretches over continents. It's not fast, it's not always reliable, but it's astonishingly human. A web spun across the emptiest place on Earth, held together by nothing more than memory, hope, and a handful of travelers who refuse to let words die in the sand. The desert gifts you another cold dawn, the sky blushing faintly above the dunes, as if embarrassed to reveal how empty the day will be. Today, the couriers promise you something rare, a glimpse of one of the great manuscript caravans, those fabled journeys where letters and packages swelled into something more. Whole libraries on the move, stitched together by the Sahara's stubborn arteries of trade and message. By mid-morning, the caravan veers toward a flat expanse where the sand gives way to hard-packed earth. In the distance, you see a long line of camels, taller than any you've seen so far, their loads covered in tight leather wrappings. As you draw closer, you realize those loads aren't salt or dates. They're bundles of manuscripts, rolled scrolls, leather-bound books, tied up and swaying like sleepy passengers on the camel humps. Historians tell us that Timbuktu wasn't just a fabled city of gold, it was a city of paper, ink, and ideas. By the 14th century, its scholars collected texts on everything from astronomy to law to medicine. And while most people think of camel caravans hauling goods for sale, a quieter, stranger commerce existed here. Caravans carrying manuscripts and letters, sometimes as trade items, sometimes as diplomatic gifts, sometimes simply as portable wisdom on its way to a new home. One mainstream fact is that wealthy families commissioned these book caravans to connect distant centers of learning. A student leaving Timbuktu for Cairo might send ahead requests for rare texts, and months later, a train of camels might arrive, bearing knowledge worth more than gold dust. It wasn't the postal system in the modern sense, but it was a way of sending ideas across continents, a fragile network that depended on trust, route memory, and the desert's fickle mercy. The quirky tidbit: scholars whisper of a book camel in one caravan, so laden with manuscripts it needed its own assistant just to keep the stacks balanced, like an anxious librarian on four legs. Legend has it that if the camel sneezed or knelt wrong, entire libraries tumbled into the sand, and a frantic repacking session ensued under the scorching sun. Historians still argue if this story is true or just a desert exaggeration, but you glance at a particularly overloaded camel now and think, yes, it could happen. You're introduced to one of the manuscript keepers, a wiry man with ink stains on his fingers, as though even out here the written word clings to him. He explains that these journeys often included personal letters hidden among the books, folded inside manuscripts like secret bookmarks. A ruler might send not just a diplomatic note, but a treatise on law or an annotated poem, hoping to impress a distant court. Knowledge itself was a message, slow, delicate, but powerful. As the caravan halts to rest, a small ritual unfolds. The keepers unpack part of their load, laying manuscripts on mats to check for damage. You crouch nearby, inhaling the scent of old leather, ink, and dust. Pages flutter in the breeze, carrying words written by hands long dead, thoughts crossing a desert more vast than imagination. You realize this was one of the Sahara's most precious postal routes, not for lovers' letters or merchant tallies, but for the survival of ideas. Historians still debate how widespread these book caravans were. Were they rare luxury events reserved for scholars and kings, or a more common sight in the intellectual heyday of the Mali and Songhai empires? Some evidence suggests an entire trade in copied manuscripts, with scribes working by candlelight to fill orders destined for faraway cities. Others believe these were isolated journeys, extraordinary and fragile. Like many desert mysteries, the truth is swallowed by time and sand. As night settles and the stars bloom overhead, you lie awake, listening to the soft rustle of leather wraps as they're tightened around manuscripts for safety. Somewhere out here, long before printed books, words rode camels across this ocean of silence, carrying dreams, prayers, and discoveries toward readers who might never meet the writers face to face. It feels strangely comforting to know that even in this harsh, trackless world, people risk their lives to keep messages alive, not just for business, not just for family, but for the simple belief that knowledge deserved a journey of its own. The day begins with a thin, icy wind whistling over the dunes, a reminder that the desert is not always fire hot. As you shake the chill from your bones and climb on to your reluctant camel, you're told today's road, if you can call it that, passes through what couriers jokingly nickname the graveyard of directions, a wide, rolling expanse where dunes shift so often no landmark stays put for more than a week. And yet, somehow, messages still made it through here for centuries. No signposts, no trails, just instinct, stars, and what the couriers describe as the desert whisper, a phrase you suspect is more poetic than practical. Mainstream historians know that navigation on these routes relied heavily on celestial cues, North Star for orientation, the sun for time, and, when skies clouded over, sometimes nothing but wind direction and gut feeling. Desert lore says seasoned couriers could tell they were veering off course by how sand stuck to their lips or the faint smell of far-off vegetation. Watching your guides, you wonder if that's exaggerated, until one of them suddenly points left, adjusts course, and later shows you a tuft of scrub barely visible on the horizon, proving his point. The quirky tidbit that makes you chuckle is that some letters were apparently delivered upside down or back to front because the courier who carried them got turned around in a sandstorm, wandered in circles for days, and only later rejoined a main route. A few surviving accounts tell of letters addressed to the merchant who lives by the second well after the crooked dune, which, thanks to a storm, suddenly became the third well before the straight dune. Historians still argue if these mistakes were rare flukes or a constant hazard that people simply learned to shrug off. At midday, you pass the remains of a way marker, a cairn of stones that once stood tall but now sprawls like a collapsed spine, its topmost rock half buried. The couriers debate whether it was an intentional signpost or just a cairn left by lost travelers, hoping to say, "We were here." This sparks a quiet conversation about maps, not the parchment kind, you know, but mind maps, living, shared among travelers, changing with every journey. The desert, they say, isn't a thing you can draw once and keep. It breathes, shifts, rearranges itself every season, and any attempt to pin it down forever is folly. Evening brings the real test of desert direction. Stars. As twilight deepens, you ride beside one of the younger couriers, who tilts his chin up, reciting names of constellations in a sing-song voice. "That's the guide to Tuat," he says, tracing a line you can barely make out. "That cluster means we're on the old trade road, not the pilgrim's path." It feels like you've fallen into a planetarium lecture, except your seat is lurching under you, and the air tastes like dust. Historians still debate whether early trans-Saharan routes were as reliable as some chronicles claim. How often did messages vanish in places like this? Were there countless words swallowed by sandstorms and forgotten wells? Or do we underestimate how skilled these couriers really were? Looking up at the crisp, impossible sky, you start to believe the latter. These riders, these walkers, had compasses in their bones, navigation stitched into their very breathing. Night settles fully, and the caravan halts under a sky that looks too vast to be real. No roads, no lights, only stars, memory, and the quiet faith that by this time tomorrow you'll be closer to your destination, carrying letters and words that refuse to die even in the desert's most confusing corridors. By now, your skin feels permanently coated in a thin layer of sand and salt, as though the desert is slowly reclaiming you grain by grain. The caravan rises before dawn, setting off toward what the couriers call the Wells of Arawane, a legendary chain of water stops known for more than just survival. They were postal hubs where letters could change direction entirely, traveling like desert swallows toward unexpected destinations. Arawane itself is no city, just a scatter of low huts and wind-battered walls half swallowed by dunes. But as you approach, you see the bustle. Camels kneel in clouds of dust. Traders shout greetings, and under a tattered awning, a man squats beside a makeshift table piled high with folded letters, wax seals glinting faintly. This, your guides tell you, is what passed for a desert post office. The mainstream historical fact? Many desert wells doubled as information centers. Chroniclers from the 14th and 15th centuries describe how caravans arrived not just to drink and rest, but to exchange letters, rumors, and news bulletins. Messages heading toward Marrakesh or Tunis could be handed off here, saving weeks of travel. If you imagine a modern postal sorting center but replace conveyor belts with camels and dusty ledgers, you're close enough. And yet, a quirky tidbit makes you grin. Sometimes these postmasters had no reading skills at all. They memorized who gave them which letter, who should receive it, and relied on seals, twine color, or even distinctive smells of certain inks or perfumes to keep parcels sorted. There's a tale of a postkeeper in Arawane who famously identified an important merchant's letter purely because the sender always scented his parchment with crushed mint. Historians still argue if this level of postal perfume coating was real practice or just desert folklore, but you inhale deeply at the piles of folded notes and catch faint whiffs of spices, rosewater, even smoke from foreign hearths. Maybe the legend isn't so far-fetched. As you sit in the shade, you notice a small ritual whenever new letters arrive. The postmaster calls out names, a few recipients step forward, and the messages are read aloud for everyone to hear. Privacy, it seems, is a modern luxury. Out here, survival trumps secrecy, and getting the news is more important than who else hears it. A man receives a note saying his cousin reached Gao safely and sighs in relief. Another laughs as a trader's joke, scrawled in shaky handwriting, makes the crowd chuckle. Later, you're offered tea so sweet it makes your teeth ache. One courier explains that sometimes messages waited here for months, hoping a passing caravan would carry them onward. And on rare occasions, they never moved at all, eventually burned for warmth or chewed to pulp by bored goats. You wince at the thought of love letters and contracts turning into goat fodder, but apparently it happened often enough to become a running joke among travelers. "Send your message fast," they say, "before it becomes lunch." Historians still debate how organized this network of desert wells truly was. Some claim each had a designated keeper who knew every route and every courier by name. Others suggest it was more chaotic, relying on luck, generosity, and memory. Looking around at Erewhon's shifting chaos, a man shouting for his missing letter, another rummaging through a leather satchel. It feels like both theories are true at once. Order and mess, hope and chance, all tangled under a blistering sun. As twilight bleeds across the sky, you watch couriers saddle up, carrying not just water and salt now, but also a fresh bundle of messages, including one sealed with a smear of gold dust destined for a sultan far to the north. You feel as though you've stepped into a living heartbeat of desert communication, a fragile, improvised system that somehow kept empires connected across the most inhospitable landscape imaginable. When you finally lie down under the stars, you think about the post office you just witnessed. No stamps, no mail trucks, just human memory, patience, and faith that words would find their way, hopping from well to well like tired birds chasing a distant horizon. The morning begins with a low, humming tension in the air, like the desert has decided today will test everyone's patience. You're told to keep your scarf ready, because somewhere ahead lies a stretch notorious for sandstorms. The couriers exchange glances, mutter prayers, and double-check that the message bundles are tightly sealed in waxed leather. You catch a glimpse of a letter being slipped into a hollow reed, an extra layer of protection, like a ship in a bottle hoping to ride out a storm at sea. Mainstream history records sandstorms as one of the greatest hazards for Saharan communication. They didn't just delay journeys, they could erase them. Caravans vanished, dunes shifted overnight, and letters, sometimes whole mail trains, were swallowed for good. Surviving travelogues from the 14th and 15th centuries mention messages lost to the breath of God, a poetic way of saying the wind had claimed them forever. By noon, you feel the first stinging gusts. The horizon smudges, the sky turns a sickly yellow, and the couriers rush to bundle every scrap of correspondence under thick cloths, tying knots like sailors before a gale. You duck low on your camel as grit peppers your neck and ears. Voices are muffled, footsteps disappear, and for a few long minutes, it feels like the entire desert is a shaken snow globe of fire-colored sand. The quirky tidbit that makes you laugh nervously afterward. Some traders claimed sandstorms acted as an accidental postal thief. Stories tell of letters and scraps of parchment being ripped from saddlebags and carried for miles, showing up weeks later in some distant well, delivered by the desert itself to completely unintended recipients. Historians still argue whether these tales are true or simply desperate humor born from losing valuables to the wind. But you can imagine a bored shepherd finding a love letter addressed to a queen and using it as kindling, none the wiser. When the storm finally clears, the world looks like it's been rearranged. Dunes have shifted into new ridges, familiar landmarks erased. The caravan stops to take stock, checking every satchel, every strap. A few letters are gone, simply lifted away by the storm's invisible hands. A couple of small parcels have been crushed under panicked camels kneeling for shelter. Yet, miraculously, most of the messages have survived, thanks to layers of cloth, leather, and raw stubbornness. You're struck by how fragile this entire network is. How one bad wind can break the chain of communication stretching across thousands of miles. And yet people tried, century after century, willing to risk their words against a desert that didn't care. Historians still debate the scale of these losses. Some argue that as many letters were destroyed by storms and mishaps as ever reached their destinations, making the Sahara as much a graveyard of messages as a road for them. Others believe that enough survived to keep empires linked, a triumph of persistence over nature's indifference. As evening falls, you watch couriers carefully repairing satchels and retightening bindings, their movements slow and deliberate, as though every knot is a promise. Never again will the desert steal these words. The fire crackles, the stars pierce the dark like holes in a black cloth, and you fall asleep with a strange respect for these stubborn carriers. They weren't just delivering letters. They were fighting to keep human voices alive against a world determined to scatter them like sand. The desert morning tastes like ash from last night's campfire, dry and lingering on your tongue. As the caravan packs up, you notice a small bundle wrapped in cloth being placed on a camel with unusual care. A courier explains in a low voice, "This is a royal packet, a message of state, carrying instructions for a provincial governor far to the north." Such letters, they say, are guarded like treasure, for a single scrap of parchment can shift armies or change the fate of a city. Mainstream historical accounts tell us that royal and political messages crossed the Sahara for centuries, linking empires like Mali, Songhai, and Morocco with far-flung territories. These weren't idle notes. They were treaties, tax records, orders for trade embargoes, even marriage proposals meant to seal alliances. The desert's postal routes weren't just a convenience. They were arteries of power, fragile yet vital, keeping rulers informed of rebellions, droughts, and new wealth discovered beyond their immediate reach. What's quirky, and admittedly a bit ridiculous, is how some of these vital letters were disguised. There are tales of emissaries tucking royal decrees inside date baskets or sewing them into saddle blankets, both to avoid bandits and to ensure plausible deniability if caught. One story claims a scribe once hid a diplomatic marriage contract by rolling it tightly and slipping it into a hollowed-out cheese wheel, only for a hungry camel handler to eat half of it before realizing what it was. Historians still argue whether this is a fable told to amuse caravans at night, or if somewhere in an archive there's a treaty with bite marks. The pace today is brisk, couriers glancing behind often. Banditry on these routes was no myth. Small raiding parties sometimes targeted postal caravans, hoping to intercept letters that carried secrets or ransoms worth a king's favor. You pass a half-buried marker stone rumored to memorialize a courier slain decades ago for refusing to surrender his messages. There's a silent reverence as you ride past, each rider tightening his grip on his reins, reminded that words could be as dangerous as gold in this desert. Midday heat wilts the group's spirits, but by dusk, a scene unfolds that reminds you why these networks existed. In a small oasis town, the royal packet changes hands, received by a man in embroidered robes who bows slightly to the courier. Within moments, other riders set out in different directions, carrying copies of its orders to surrounding villages. You witness in real time how a single message splinters into many, rippling outward like water poured on dry ground, connecting distant rulers to people they might never see. Historians still debate how fast such political messages truly moved. Some sources boast of orders traveling 1,000 miles in mere weeks, carried relay style from camel to camel. Others suggest months of delay, with entire edicts arriving too late to matter. Watching the efficient handoff here, you suspect both are true. When urgency demanded, men and beasts were pushed to exhaustion. When not, messages wandered the sands at the desert's lazy pace. That night, by the campfire, a courier tells you softly, "Empires rise and fall, but the desert swallows most of their words." You imagine royal decrees lying unread beneath dunes, seals intact, their commands meaningless now. Yet somehow, enough words survived to knit vast lands together, fragile threads stretched across an endless sea of sand. And under the same indifferent stars, you fall asleep, knowing you've ridden alongside the ghostly backbone of old power, where the fate of thousands once hung on a few dusty pages bouncing on a camel's flank. Dawn creeps in slowly today, painting the desert in shades of rose and gold, as if trying to apologize for yesterday's dust-laden winds. The caravan moves at a gentler pace, the camels plodding with that peculiar rolling gait that feels like you're perched on the back of a sleepy ship. Word drifts through the group that you'll pass by one of the fabled poetry stops, a meeting place where couriers and travelers paused not only to water animals and rest, but also to trade messages of a different kind, songs, verses, and spoken letters that never existed on paper at all. Mainstream historical accounts of Saharan communication usually focus on tangible messages, written letters, decrees, and trade records. But many words here rode on memory alone. In regions where literacy was limited or where parchment was too precious, oral letters were entrusted to human couriers. These messengers memorized poems or carefully phrased greetings, repeating them word for word over long journeys. Some chronicles describe them as walking ink, living scrolls who could carry a ruler's blessing, a merchant's instruction, or a lover's lament across hundreds of miles without a single written mark. The quirky tidbit that makes you smile: Desert Lore says certain messengers were prized for having musical memories. Families would request their services not because they were fast, but because they had pleasing voices, able to deliver even a scolding message in a tune that made the sting more bearable. There's even a fragmentary story about a courier who sang his messages so beautifully that a caravan once delayed its departure just to hear him finish a particularly dramatic verse about lost camels and missed love. Historians still argue whether this was common practice or romantic embellishment, but hearing a courier hum to himself as you ride, you suspect truth hides in the song. By mid-morning, you reach a low, flat rock where travelers gather in loose circles. It's not a town, not even a proper camp, but it has a reputation, a place where words are refreshed. Couriers arriving from different routes recite what they've been carrying, checking details with others to make sure nothing was forgotten or warped by time. You sit quietly, listening as mews, greetings, and half-sung messages ripple through the crowd like water being shared. A boy recites a long, winding blessing from a grandmother to her distant grandchildren, not missing a syllable, despite having walked barefoot for weeks. A trader corrects a name, ensuring a promise of payment reaches the right man days ahead. No pens, no ink, just human memory holding communities together. Later, as the sun slants toward afternoon, you hear a tale of a single spoken message that traveled for over a year before reaching its destination, passed from mouth to mouth, each courier treating it as sacred cargo. It's said that not a word changed along the way, but historians still debate if that's possible in a world where even a short campfire story shifts and mutates after a few retellings. Perhaps the desert demanded a different kind of focus, where forgetting was as dangerous as losing a sealed letter to the wind. That evening, around a shared fire, a courier demonstrates how he trains his memory, chanting phrases over and over, using rhythm and melody to lock them in place. You can almost see the old desert networks in action, invisible lines of connection, carried in human breath and voice, messages wandering for weeks and months, kept alive by memory alone. You think about how many words never made it to parchment, how many personal stories vanished with the messengers who carried them, leaving only silence behind. Sleep comes slowly under the starlight, your mind repeating snatches of sung greetings you've heard today. In a world where writing was fragile, these oral letters seem even more vulnerable, yet strangely more intimate. Words warmed by a human voice, carried through sand and starlight, and entrusted only to those who remembered how precious every syllable was. Dawn creeps in slowly today, painting the desert in shades of rose and gold, as if trying to apologize for yesterday's dust-laden winds. The caravan moves at a gentler pace, the camels plodding with that peculiar rolling gait that feels like you're perched on the back of a sleepy ship. Word drifts through the group that you'll pass by one of the fabled poetry stops, a meeting place where couriers and travelers paused not only to water animals and rest, but also to trade messages of a different kind. Songs, verses, and spoken letters that never existed on paper at all. Mainstream historical accounts of Saharan communication usually focus on tangible messages, written letters, decrees, and trade records, but many words here rode on memory alone. In regions where literacy was limited, or where parchment was too precious, oral letters were entrusted to human couriers. These messengers memorized poems or carefully phrased greetings, repeating them word for word over long journeys. Some chronicles describe them as walking ink, living scrolls who could carry a ruler's blessing, a merchant's instruction, or a lover's lament across hundreds of miles without a single written mark. The quirky tidbit that makes you smile, desert lore says certain messengers were prized for having musical memories. Families would request their services not because they were fast, but because they had pleasing voices, able to deliver even a scolding message in a tune that made the sting more bearable. There's even a fragmentary story about a courier who sang his messages so beautifully that a caravan once delayed its departure just to hear him finish a particularly dramatic verse about lost camels and missed love. Historians still argue whether this was common practice or romantic embellishment. But hearing a courier hum to himself as you ride, you suspect truth hides in the song. By mid-morning, you reach a low, flat rock where travelers gather in loose circles. It's not a town, not even a proper camp, but it has a reputation, a place where words are refreshed. Couriers arriving from different routes recite what they've been carrying, checking details with others to make sure nothing was forgotten or warped by time. You sit quietly, listening as news, greetings, and half-sung messages ripple through the crowd like water being shared. A boy recites a long, winding blessing from a grandmother to her distant grandchildren, not missing a syllable despite having walked barefoot for weeks. A trader corrects a name, ensuring a promise of payment reaches the right man days ahead. No pens, no ink, just human memory holding communities together. Later, as the sun slants toward afternoon, you hear a tale of a single spoken message that traveled for over a year before reaching its destination, passed from mouth to mouth, each courier treating it as sacred cargo. It's said that not a word changed along the way, but historians still debate if that's possible in a world where even a short campfire story shifts and mutates after a few retellings. Perhaps the desert demanded a different kind of focus, where forgetting was as dangerous as losing a sealed letter to the wind. That evening, around a shared fire, a courier demonstrates how he trains his memory, chanting phrases over and over, using rhythm and melody to lock them in place. You can almost see the old desert networks in action, invisible lines of connection, carried in human breath and voice, messages wandering for weeks and months, kept alive by memory alone. You think about how many words never made it to parchment, how many personal stories vanished with the messengers who carried them, leaving only silence behind. Sleep comes slowly under the starlight, your mind repeating snatches of sung greetings you've heard today. In a world where writing was fragile, these oral letters seem even more vulnerable, yet strangely more intimate. Words warmed by a human voice, carried through sand and starlight, and entrusted only to those who remembered how precious every syllable was. The desert greets you today with a thin silver fog, rare and unsettling. The sun hangs pale, barely a coin in the sky, and the horizon blurs into something dreamlike. The couriers whisper about phantoms on the sand, a name for these strange days when shapes in the distance look like caravans or towns, but vanish as you draw near. It feels like stepping into a mirage you can't wake from. This stretch of the route is where desert myths come alive, where messages were said to ride on invisible roads, or where lost letters wandered endlessly, never finding their recipient, as if swallowed by another world. Mainstream historical accounts mention real disappearances, whole groups of couriers failing to arrive, their fates unknown. Some were likely victims of shifting dunes, raiders, or thirst. But out here, local lore says some letters were taken by the silent riders, ghosts of old messengers doomed to roam the desert forever, delivering words that no one is left to hear. The quirky detail you overhear from an older courier makes you smile uneasily. People sometimes pinned small bells or beads to sealed letters, believing the sound would help keep spirits, or misfortune, away. Apparently, even mail needed luck charms to survive these parts. Historians still argue if this was widespread or just an occasional superstition among certain Tuareg tribes, but you see one such letter yourself today, a tiny bead tied into its string, glinting softly in the weak sun. By midday, you ride past a crumbling way station, long abandoned, half eaten by sand and time. Its doorway is arched like a mouth yawning silently. Your guides explain this was once a meeting point for letters heading west toward the Niger Bend. Nobody knows why it was deserted. Some blame a raid, others a dried-up well. But one story claims that messages stopped arriving here because the route itself shifted. A whole path across the desert forgotten as travelers gradually took another trail, leaving this outpost stranded in the middle of nowhere. You picture sacks of mail lying in some long-lost storeroom, buried by sand, never read, their paper crumbling into nothing but whispers on the wind. Historians still debate how many postal routes were truly permanent in the Sahara. Were they fixed and dependable, or living things, constantly moving like rivers over centuries? The surviving records suggest both. The desert's memory is imperfect. It can erase a road as easily as a letter, bending history into mysteries. Evening comes, and the fog lifts just enough for you to see strange shapes rising from the sand, half-buried markers and weathered camel bones. The caravan grows quiet. A courier murmurs a blessing for those who never made it, their words lost forever. And you realize the desert holds two kinds of letters: the ones that find their way and the ones that sleep eternally beneath the dunes, unread messages buried under centuries of silence. As you lie under the stars, a desert breeze brushes your cheek, and you imagine it's carrying fragments of all those forgotten words, promises, warnings, love notes, royal decrees, floating softly through time. Perhaps, you think, no letter is ever truly lost. The desert just keeps some for itself. The caravan's mood shifts on your final day across the postal trail. There's a quiet, unspoken sense of accomplishment. Letters have survived storms, bandits, memory lapses, and the mercurial moods of the desert itself. Today's destination is one of the oldest surviving postal markets, a place where messages, goods, and news collided in a buzzing chaos of human connection that bridged entire continents. You crest a long dune to see it sprawled below, a semi-permanent camp where tents shimmer like sails on golden waves. Smoke rises in thin spirals, mingling with the smell of roasted millet and camel sweat. Everywhere you look, Bundles of letters change hands. Writers from Morocco arrive dusty and triumphant. Couriers from Timbuktu argue about promised payments. A scribe sits cross-legged beneath a woven canopy, furiously copying one letter into 5 versions for 5 different destinations. Mainstream historical accounts tell us that places like this, half settlement, half logistical miracle, kept Africa, the Mediterranean, and even Europe faintly tethered. A message born on the banks of the Niger might eventually, through painstaking relay, reach Cairo, Fez, or even Venice. Historians still debate how accurate or reliable these connections were, yet the evidence of trade agreements and correspondence between far-flung rulers suggests at least some letters did make the improbable journey. The quirky tidbit that draws a chuckle from your weary lips. One 16th century source claims a caravan once carried a single message for so long that when it finally reached its intended recipient, the sender had been dead for 2 decades. The recipient supposedly replied with only one line, "Tell him thank you anyway." Whether myth or truth, it perfectly captures the absurd patience required for desert correspondence. As you sit beneath a canopy sipping bitter tea, you watch as one courier prepares to head back south, loading up with new instructions for trade expeditions and heartfelt messages wrapped in palm leaves. The cycle never stops. Words forever crawl across the Sahara like ants tracing uncertain lines toward distant hopes. Historians still debate whether this sprawling, improvised system counts as a true postal service. There were no stamps, no fixed schedules, and often no certainty a letter would reach its target. Yet looking around this camp, seeing human determination woven into every knot of string and every carefully folded scrap, you realize it wasn't just a postal network, it was a lifeline, keeping scattered families, merchants, and empires connected across a world that otherwise felt endless and silent. Night settles in slowly, the desert turning cool and still. The final letters are tied to saddlebags, lanterns wink out one by one, and the caravan sleeps under an ocean of stars. You stretch out on your blanket, bone-tired but oddly content, knowing you've witnessed a fragile miracle, a network born of grit, memory, and sheer faith that words deserve to travel no matter the cost. Now, let the desert fade from your mind. Picture the last campfire's glow softening to embers, the camels finally resting, their long lashes drooping. The faint rustle of parchment in leather bags is the only sound, as if the night itself is reading the letters aloud in a language too ancient to disturb you. The air cools, wrapping you in comfort after days of heat and grit, and the stars stretch infinitely above, patient and calm. Breathe slowly. Imagine each inhalation as a gentle breeze crossing an endless dune, each exhale settling the sand smooth again. All the urgency of messages and journeys drifts away, leaving only stillness. You're safe, far from the long roads, no letters left to carry, no storms to outrun. The desert's vast silence is now your companion, soft and timeless. Let your mind rest in that quiet expanse, your body growing heavier, your eyelids falling like closing tents. Tonight nothing is lost, nothing left undelivered. Only peace remains.